I read this and I think that you're right. You made some comments, which is, it only came up, I listened to it, I listened to a later lecture, and Leonard was saying there's a difference between reconstructing an induction versus creating an induction. And
Yeah.
he said if he was creating an induction, well, he wouldn't even be teaching this course anymore. He doesn't even know what he'd be doing. So I think that makes sense. It's valid. And so I've got to expect that I'm going to be starting from someone else's thinking. That's just how it is. And then I'm going to be reducing it.
Yes.
The only thing I'd say is, and I've tried to change this since, is that when I write these, I think the only thing I'd change is I try and make a bit more of an explicit connection between what I'm doing and the actual thing I'm trying to induce. So for example, when I just started with fundamental distinction, living and non-living entities, it would be something like, I'm reducing man's means of survival. That's how I got here. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And then I think that would be better, because I'm like, the connection is clear. Like, here's why I'm doing this, as opposed to why am I even starting here? And then I suddenly magically get to the thing I'm trying to induce. Okay, what else? The Aristotle. I think I want to discuss that with you shortly, the link you posted.
Yeah.
You said that concepts are not context, they're related, but they're not context. Okay.
Just like, where do you use the concepts? Like, where do you use them? Where do you say them? Where in the world, not just.
If I'm saying that man functions by reason and generalizes, then if I do ask, well, how does that work? Then I do get to concept. So in some way, aren't I depending on concept? Like, concepts are valid as a kind of context.
Yeah, a background knowledge context.
Right.
So I just try to differentiate between specifically a concept as a context versus, well, a knowledge context. I guess there's only subtle differences between those words. Yeah, you could have a knowledge context in reference to what concepts were assumed in this discussion, but you also need to keep in mind things like, where is the concept used, not just the nature of the concept itself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, where do you use the concept about life? Well, for example, you use in biology, that could be a context, or the context could be when you're talking about the meaning of life. I mean, well, that's because the word life isn't the same thing, but when you're talking about what the mind is, maybe it assumes a biological context, like a subject matter, I guess you could say.
As far as other methods of thinking go, you said I should show other methods of thinking, mention them somehow. Would that mean listing known alternatives, like those which are discussed and people have, like,
which one?
Mystic revelation or intuition? Does that mean I'd need to go into that, or isn't it enough if I just assume context is reason is the faculty that generalizes, deduces, and then show that all productions or creations of humans have that in common? Like, and then I don't need to go into, any of these other so-called methods of knowledge.
What was the original? What was I commenting on specifically?
Originally,
I forget the sentence.
Yeah, originally I wrote, like, I was trying to do it this way. I think I did.
It was up higher.
This is I got rid of it, but it was in the first version iteration, which is, I said something like, well, feelings can't always be true. They don't always reflect reality. And then I try to kind of very briefly look at alternatives and go, oh, so this isn't the source. But actually, when I looked at the answer or the key in the lectures, he said, okay, all you need to do is show what are the common denominators between these different these different things that man needs for survival. And then he said, okay, well, you can see generalization and deductions. And so then you can go, reason is responsible for those. You don't need to do anything else.
Let me open it again. I'll read it.
I can find the old one and I'll tell you exactly where it is.
because
Yeah.
I feel like that would explain.
So let's see. Reason is survival comments. Okay, so then I go.
Let's see.
Oh, it's the last paragraph. I said something like, let's consider alternatives. And I did it so briefly. I did sense data, emotions, mystical revelation, sense data. We cannot see X-rays, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm like, sense data doesn't help us produce a food factory. And then I go on quickly to emotions. We feel something is true, but it's not necessarily true. And so he didn't seem to take that approach in at least his key to the induction, which.
Hold on. I think I have it.
So maybe in the case
There we
of
go.
as a tool of survival, it's reason. But then the question of whether there are other sources of knowledge would be a separate question. And then it might be analyzing, well, what do those, like we've already established.
Oh, I
that.
see what I was saying.
Yeah, okay.
I think I was just saying that as far as reference, is there a reason to mention anything about anything besides reason? Is how I was interpreting your question. Should we bother talking about faith or intuition and whatnot? So it says sure. Because you do want to exclude something else. You need something of comparison. And if you just mention the known ones, that's fine. I think that would be fine. As long as you are uniting things, finding some way to unite them and also differentiate them, then I think it's good. Or that's
Isn't
all
it-
you really need to do, I think.
You don't think it's enough to do reason, faculty of generalizing, deducing, making inferences, drawing conclusions, and then showing that all of those goods that are necessary for man's survival have the common denominator of generalizing, deducing, and then that seems to be okay to me so far. And then the question of what I try to inject into my essay about other methods of knowledge would be in a separate induction. Like, well, are there other methods of knowledge? What do these so-called other methods help us with? You know what I'm saying? Like maybe that would be a separate.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense to me that you would always need at least one differentiating thing. That's
Okay.
what I was thinking in my mind.
Got it.
Peacock didn't mention needing something to differentiate from.
I don't think so. No. Well, he did, but what he differentiated, what this is where I've got a question about this later. But as far as contrasting goes, so the method of contrasting, what he contrasted was actually how men and animals acquire their goods of survival. And then what he did was he found that the common denominator in all goods acquired or created by man that he needs for a survival is reason. So
yeah, I think that would work too. I mean, that would be a different way of differentiating than I thought. I think that would work too. Because in a way, that is two different methods. It's just phrased differently. Like their method of perception, whatever you want to call it. And reason is something not that. So in a way, that is the differentiating thing I'm talking about.
So
whatever animals do and then reason. You could just even split it up that way.
Actually, I just realized my approach actually to do that, if I did try and contrast different methods of knowledge, I would kind of be ending up in a reductio ad absurdum that isn't appropriate, because I'd be like, well, these other methods don't work and there's only reason, so therefore reason. Whereas if I approach it in looking for the different goods that man produces and I find the common denominator in those goods, then I've reached it through induction as opposed to mathematical reductio ad absurdum. So maybe that is better, but then I would need to do a separate essay of like different methods of knowledge if I wanted to explore that.
Yeah, I mean, you could, I just mean that you need to be at least be able to differentiate reason from something else. As long as I think by methods of how animals think, I think is a good differentiation to use.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So you're right. So there is a built-in.
Yeah.
distinction, but that distinction is between sense perception and action based on that sense perception and
Yeah,
reason,
maybe
and
I
that's enough.
yeah, maybe I shouldn't say means of knowledge, but ways of thinking or ways of operating, something
Right.
like that.
Right.
You don't need the definition because the induction is just some working definition is fine even.
And am I right in saying that it's not that it's unnecessary? It's not that it's even optional. It's just not necessary to start talking about LSD or mystic revelation as a means of knowledge, because I've already made the relevant comparisons, and I've already made an induction to show that reason is what's responsible for the goods produced by man.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, what was the last sentence? I missed that.
I was just saying I'm right. I'm right in saying, and I'm just getting a confirmation that actually it's enough of a comparison just to do sense perception and reason, because and it's not even that it's optional, it's unnecessary to talk about mystic revelation or anything, because I've already shown that reason is what's this generalization, deduction, inference is what's responsible for the goods produced.
Yeah, that'd be a separate question, what faith or intuition is. Like somebody could ask later, like, oh, does intuition do anything? Well,
right,
that's a new induction, I think.
Right,
as long as you differentiate it from something, in animals would be the best differentiation I think you could use.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I was a bit harsh on myself, I think, because I thought I should be. I'm realizing now with this distinction that you made and he made, like there's reconstruction versus creation. So if I talk about nutrients, I can't expect to identify everything firsthand. I kind of need to rely on other people's knowledge, obviously.
Yeah.
You asked me, I think I worded this badly. You commented on this, which I said, living species require a certain environment, and if they don't have that environment, they become extinct. And you said, well, is that really true? And you made a valid point. I think maybe the way to think about it would have been that animals adapt to their environment, whereas obviously we can adapt the environment to us. So they can migrate, but they still depend on another environment, whereas we can live in a frozen tundra. But I didn't make that point quite.
I knew that's what you were getting at. I was just making it clear why the phrasing logically didn't follow.
Yeah, it's good. I picked up on that when you commented, so that's good. And let's see. Yeah, so this is me complaining again, but you're right about this creation, reconstruction distinction. Okay, cool. Let me save that. Let's go to the four causes, since you put that in this essay. We can.
Yes.
Okay, there were some interesting things in there that I wanted to. Yeah. Actually, you know what? How about we just throw in some aphorisms before we do that?
Sure. Break up the routine.
Required for debate. Whoever does not know how to put his thoughts on ice should not engage in the heat of argument. Oh, these are the distinctions you mentioned. So he follows this pattern of trying to, what did you call it? Like contrasts.
Contraries, I think.
Contraries, yeah.
Aristotle likes that word contrary. That's why he used the contraries. So ice, cold and hot, it gives a good vividness to it. There's a power to it.
Yeah, this one seems obvious to me. I wonder if there's more to draw from it, but it's basically something like cool your emotions when engaging in a rational discussion, which is surprising because I didn't expect Nietzsche to have that.
Well, I think you would say there is a heat, but then in a way, what if you could put it on ice and still engage in heated argument? What would that mean? Is that even possible? I don't even know. He's implying that you could know that there's a way to write your thoughts on ice and engage in the heat of argument. I mean, if he's saying whoever does not know, what about those who do know? I don't know.
Whoever does not should not engage in the heat of argument. What about those who know they should engage in the heat of argument? Okay, I see. So you can have the heated argument, but you've got to ice your thoughts.
Yeah, or maybe he's even saying that you can use contradictions even. In a way, I'm not sure. Because this is a contradiction practically. They would melt in the other argument. So how could anyone put them on the ice?
Right.
But it's like something like the facts be damned, my passions are gonna push me through. That's almost how I interpret it. The one who can engage with their instincts and just push through the argument, regardless of what things are, regardless of the pain. That's how I'm interpreting it. I'm getting really deep for a one sentence quote, so, but that's what I think of those images.
Isn't that the purpose, to get deep into unpack one
Yeah.
sentence with subjective superimposed ideas?
I think that's why I use these images that don't make much sense. Like, how can you have ice and heat at the same time? It's like, it makes you want to be like almost annoyed at it, because like, why are you saying a contradiction? It sounds dumb, but it's like, why does it bother me even? But
Why is it? Do you think it's a matter of, when people do get into a heated argument and they get upset over something that's seemingly small, do you think it's a case of it's hard to know exactly what it is, but there are like broader implications for their worldview if they're wrong on this? So for some reason they react in a either evasive or angry way. Like there are broader implications, like, oh, everyone's going to think this or whatever else. I don't know what could be deep down there, but
the reaction, the more implication there is. I would put it that way, generally speaking. That it says more about the more they react to it. The emotional response is in relation to the value, to the degree they value something, I think.
Okay, what do you think of this? I don't know. I think Ayn Rand said this, or maybe it was Leonard Peikoff. I think it was Ayn Rand, but I'm not sure. It's something like, when you notice that the violence of your emotion doesn't match the clarity of your understanding, that's an indication that you're holding onto a mystical premise. Meaning you're holding some faith-based premise that's not reasoned. And you've heard it as well?
Yeah, I know that one, or something to that effect anyway. But yeah, that idea from Rand specifically.
And then in that case, why is there the violence of emotion then? Like, what is with that? Why does a mystical premise necessarily result in a violent emotion? I understand that it wouldn't match, whatever emotion you feel wouldn't match the clarity of your understanding, but because you don't, to hold a faith-based premise don't require understanding. So that makes sense. But then what is with the violence of emotion?
What she specifically, where's that quote from, by the way?
Well, I don't remember. I just remember that quote because it really stood out to me. It's as true. Like, I definitely have experience when I get angry about something, someone is arguing, and then I start asking myself questions like, oh, maybe I don't understand it actually that clearly. There's an element of like faith because I've taken something on in a rationalistic way. Like, oh yeah, this makes sense, but it's not inductively held, with grounded examples and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm understanding it correctly, because at first I thought you meant like, if you had to choose between your emotions and your reason, go with your reason. I thought you're referring to that kind of quote, something very paraphrased. But you're saying that whatever the quote is you're thinking of is that a violent reaction, emotional reaction, would be sign of a mystical premise?
No. It's specifically when there's a gap. Like, violent emotion is fine, but it's specifically when there's a gap between the emotion, like the emotion is intense, and yet you're reacting that way. Like, the best you can do is utter a few generalities or vaguely respond, and yet you feel this intense emotion. So when you have this gap between the clarity of your understanding and the intensity of your emotion, it's a indication of a mystical premise. So there needs to be that gap specifically. It can't just be a violent emotion.
I think it doesn't have to be a mystical premise. It just means an unanalyzed premise. That's how I would phrase it.
What would be the difference between an unanalyzed premise and a mystical premise?
Well, I think you could your emotions can indicate something that you looked over in reason that you deliberately or are not actively engaging with, maybe because you don't think it's relevant, maybe because you didn't notice it very much, but you noticed it long enough that you could react to it. And I think you could get in situations where you could have a violent reaction, but struggle to understand why. And it's more about finding whatever the problem is. It's not necessarily mystical or irrational. It could be, but it's more that you don't know what it is, I think, is the issue. It could be utterly irrational or it could be sensible. But I don't think you could say that it is necessarily one or the other.
Yeah, I agree with that actually. I think I guess the quote didn't say that, but I agree with that. It makes sense because I think of Cheryl Taggart freaking out, and yet she can't explain why she's freaking out. And she runs down the street, feels like all the lights are turning against her, everything is red. And yet there are the material required for her to make the integration and explicitly identify what is there is the material is there, and her subconscious is giving her that signal, but she can't string it together in a logical way. And so in that case, the violence of the emotion doesn't match the clarity of the understanding, and yet she is getting at something. But I guess it could go the other way too, right? It could be, so I think the takeaway is it could be an indication, like when that happens, that you're holding onto a mystical premise.
Yeah, but I think in either way is something that's kind of detached, or the connection is hard to make. You haven't strung it together in a way. So there is a detachment between reason and emotion, not in the sense that you haven't integrated the two, that there's a gap. So you don't necessarily know where the problem is, on which side of the gap the problem is. Is it that you reason it incorrectly, or is it that you react to something in a weird way, or you notice something in a strange way that you shouldn't have, or you misinterpreted something, or who knows.
What do you think in the specific case where the violence of emotion doesn't match the clarity of the understanding, and there is a mystical premise at root? Why do you think people react with that violent emotion? Like, is it similar to what Brandon said about this anxiety of being, at least even if your mystical premise already leads you to feel somewhat out of control, like if you believe in God and God determines your fate or whatever, the desire to protect that is because, or the desire, the anger or the violent emotion you feel if someone attacks that is because you, in a sense, lose whatever control you already do have, which is your understanding of the situation. Is that what the violent emotion is?
Well, in the first place, a violent emotion would just be like extremely strong and a major reaction. Just think about it in those terms. At least it's connected to values in a fundamental way.
Right.
So we know whatever the reaction is, it has to do with some key value. But I'm thinking, how is that? If you had mystical premises, why would that lead to intense emotions? Well, one could be explicit religious beliefs. That's the more obvious thing. Like, if they'll get mad if you try to, maybe if you really push the person to deny any belief in God, and if they're deep down a mystic all the way, that evidence has nothing to do with anything, then they'll probably get angry because there is nothing about the truth that will change their mind. All they could do is react, or that there's nothing else they can do except see the attack on their values. There is no alternative way to deal with it. Like, you have to just utterly deny the person, like get angry because you feel belittled, maybe. Like, oh, this is the only thing I believe in faith. I believe this by faith, not by evidence. Somebody says I shouldn't believe it. I can't prove that I should believe other than to have faith. So they're telling me not to believe is like an attack on my beliefs. Unlike somebody else, if maybe they're at least somewhat open to discussion and debate, they can at least get a question. Oh, here's the proof or evidence that, or reasons I believe. At least they're operating at something. But the more mystical it is, the less reason you could use with them, and the less that their values are amenable, or the less reason they would see they would change anything about their beliefs. Because if something is not based on truth, it's only true to the extent you demand it to be true.
What did I want to ask you? I forgot. Something related. Oh, okay, I remember now. So with that situation, do you think there has to be an extent to which someone reacting violently on an attack on their mystical belief has to feel contradictory feelings as well? Because if their belief is contradictory, then would they be necessarily feel contradictory feelings about being attacked on their belief? I don't know if this is just a very rationalistic question, but
I don't really see why they would. I think that's really, really context dependent. I don't think there's a general principle of that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I was just thinking of the quote, the aphorism we did by Nietzsche, as like a man who despises himself respects himself as one who despises.
Yes, that's very interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And how you can have someone who's suicidal and yet respects himself more than someone who isn't.
Yeah.
I don't have any more to say
it happens sometimes, but
yeah,
no general principle behind it, I think.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to Aristotle what we can.
Yeah.
So I think I want to skip, because I mean, some of this I know makes sense. You have a purpose. I got that.
Yeah.
Then you examine the opinions, you canvass all the different views. And then what else do you highlight? You go through them in an analytical way, I guess, the different views, finding the relevant facts.
Discussing like, what do other people think? What have other people thought? Like you were saying about like reconstructing an argument, that's using the thoughts of others. That's part of the inquiry.
Right. But I actually found the latter part interesting because it started talking about the development of science and Aristotle as someone who was all about the facts. And yet later on, when science developed, it was about rationalistic imagination. What did you make of, I was trying to make sense of it. Let's see if I can find, here we go.
The thing about the author is that he seemed to value the rationalism afterwards of like Galileo, because Galileo did reject some things, or at least what he thought Aristotle believed. He was more Pythagorean than you would think Galileo was. So I'm not sure what this author is trying to convey exactly, because Aristotle is all about these direct empirical evidence, and even this author seems skeptical that empirical evidence is really the way to induce the best ways. He seems to put a lot more value on math than Aristotle did. And that's why Galileo had issues with Aristotle, that he didn't put as much attention on math as he wished. And in the same way, this author seems like, oh, if only Aristotle did more math, he would have been better. I think that's what this author is saying. But overall, it's a good summary of Aristotle, but it doesn't mean the author agrees with Aristotle, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, he said he had a fruitful method, but he got trapped in empiricism. But then what's this about the method of the 17th century pioneers was very consciously formulated by studying the organon? I didn't know that. I thought they just rejected Aristotle outright.
The organon was almost rejecting Aristotle, but a tempered understanding of Aristotle, but more about the understanding of Aristotle based on Aquinas. So it's what I would call the mystical Aristotle, is what they were reacting to actually. But that's an argument I would have with the writer of this. Like, I disagree about the history, but the point is that these writers thought they were reacting against Aristotle. What they believed was anti-Aristotle, that they were doing something better than he was and fixing his problems.
Right. Yeah, his take does seem to be that Yeah, he says it here. Aristotle was too much of an empiricist. He was clearly the greatest observational scientist until the 19th century. And it's only until our modern scientific enterprise was born in the rejection of such empiricism for some form of rationalism that we get all this beautiful development of science. So it's an interpretation of the facts.
Yes.
Okay.
But then he did wonders for biology.
Right.
Like Aristotle is like the biologist, and I think the reason we even get to evolution, like there's Aristotle, then there's Darwin. I think literally that's the line it goes from.
Right. Okay.
I'm not even exaggerating.
Not a big line.
Yeah, I mean, not many people really studied it. Like Aristotle, everybody was like all into like, what are universals? What are the things above our realm of understanding? But Darwin, at least, somebody is finally getting to what's the world in front of us.
Right.
I mean, that's what Darwin did. Oh, speaking of violent reactions, Christians hated Darwin so much. And I think that's a perfect example of how violent emotions can sometimes be related to mysticism.
Right. Or like, well, I don't know. What do you make of this is a myth, and I don't know if it's true, but the story of when someone discovered the proof that square root 2 was not a whole number, the Pythagoreans threw him over a ship into sea to kill him.
I would believe it, but that's an interesting myth. I wonder if it's true. But
they did sort of base that they had reasoning for why they thought every number has to be a whole number, because that's what you observe in reality. And yet they threw him over the boat. That was how they dealt with an offensive argument.
Yeah.
Okay. We can probably finish off on one more.
Yes. But
Thanks. Go on.
Those methods is just, I mean, the highlighted parts are very useful, but just a quick thought on what Aristotle, his method of doing things. So it should be helpful.
A refined soul is distressed to know that someone owes it thanks. A crude soul is distressed that it owes thanks. Well, that's interesting. It is like the reverse. It's another, I would have expected the opposite.
Crude soul is distressed. A crude soul.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction. I didn't expect that. So I don't know. I would have, refined soul wouldn't mind.
I don't know if he's saying it's a good or bad thing to be refined.
I don't know either.
Other than this is one of the more ambiguous things, because I don't know where Nietzsche stands. That's what makes it hard to interpret. I mean, okay, refined people are viewed as those who don't like to know that people owe them anything. They don't want to receive something. And that's all I could think of. Refined people are altruists. That seems to be what he's saying. It seems like he's meaning something else as well, but I can't figure that out.
Me neither. Stop that.